Welcome to Sherlock Holmes and the Murder Beneath the Old Clocktower. Step into the misty streets of London, where every chime hides a secret and every shadow tells a lie. Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. Your mystery begins now. It was a bitterly cold evening in late November, when a solitary figure was found lifeless beneath the towering clock of Bartholomew's Square. The air was thick with fog, the kind that swallowed the gaslight whole and left only faint halos glimmering against the mist. As the tower struck midnight, its heavy chimes seemed to toll not merely the passing of the hour, but the departure of a soul. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood gazing at the body, a man of about 40, well-dressed, with one glove missing and a curious expression frozen upon his face, as though he had glimpsed something dreadful in his final moments. The cobblestones were slick with rain, and the faint ticking of the clock above lent the scene a strange, mechanical solemnity. A robbery, perhaps, one constable suggested. His pocket watch is missing. Lestrade frowned. No, too tidy for that. And look here, the wound, straight through the heart, no blood spatter, a knife withdrawn carefully, almost professionally. He turned his gaze upward to the dim outline of the clock's great face, its brass hands gleaming faintly. Whatever happened here, gentlemen? It began long before midnight. The newspapers would soon call it the Clocktower murder, and by morning, half of London was whispering about it. The victim was quickly identified as Reginald Pettigrew, a financial clerk for a respected banking firm. But there was something about his life that didn't quite fit with his death. No enemies, no debts, no apparent reason to be standing alone in that square at such an hour. 3 days later, a thin envelope arrived at 221B Baker Street. It bore no return address, only a neat scrawl on the flap. For Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Inside was a single sheet, its message written in a hand both elegant and unsteady. There is more to the death beneath the clock tower than meets the eye. The chime at midnight hides what the daylight would expose. A friend of justice. Watson recalled later that Holmes opened the letter with that peculiar glint in his eye, the one that meant he had already leapt 3 steps ahead of Scotland Yard. A friend of justice, Holmes murmured. Curious phrasing. Either a romantic soul or a very careful liar. He reached for his violin and began to play, the low notes weaving through the room like strands of thought. Watson, do you recall the peculiar case of the man who was stabbed without blood at the scene? Watson frowned. You mean the affair of the scarlet ribbon? Precisely. You will remember that the absence of blood was not due to the method of murder, but to the time of death. Holmes smiled faintly. If our Mr. Pettigrew was killed elsewhere and placed beneath the clock tower afterward, then the entire timeline of the crime collapses. We must rebuild it from the ground up. Holmes rose, already reaching for his hat and coat. Come, Watson. We shall pay a visit to Bartholomew's Square before the Yard tramples every clue underfoot. Midnight seems to be the hour of choice for our murderer, and I have a feeling that the clock itself may be keeping a secret of its own. And so, into the swirling fog of London's midnight streets they went, Holmes with his sharp stride, Watson close behind, the distant chime of the clock tower echoing like a heartbeat in the mist. The fog clung to the narrow lanes like a living thing, wrapping itself around the gas lamps and softening every sound. By the time we reached Bartholomew's Square, the last of the constables had gone, leaving the place deserted save for a single lamplighter whose flickering torch illuminated the clock tower's ancient face. The tower loomed above us, its gears faintly whirring, the pendulum hidden behind layers of damp stone and time-worn brass. Holmes paused at the edge of the square, his keen eyes scanning the cobbled ground. Note the absence of carriage tracks, Watson, he said quietly. And yet, Pettigrew was not a man to walk from his home in Hampstead to this desolate corner of the city at such an hour. Someone brought him here, but not by coach. No, not by coach at all. I crouched to observe the cobbles, glistening with rain, though I could discern nothing unusual. You think he came on foot, then? Holmes smiled faintly. Not he, his corpse. The rain has kindly wiped away most traces. But there are faint impressions here, see? A square indentation, likely from a wooden crate or box. 2 men could have carried it with ease. He paced toward the tower's base, his coat swirling behind him like a dark shadow. Observe the clock's foundation. Notice the faint line of soot upon the lower stones, Watson. There must be a vent somewhere beneath us. Perhaps a maintenance chamber or an access tunnel. Curious, is it not, that Pettigrew should be found directly above such a place? Holmes knelt and brushed his fingers along the cracks between the stones, his gaze narrowing. Someone has pried this mortar loose recently. The dust is fresh, coarse, gritty and dry despite the evening's dampness. There has been tampering here within the last 48 hours. He stood, dusting his hands. The location was not chosen at random. The killer intended for the body to be found here, beneath the chime that marks the passing of every hour. The symbolism, Watson, it's almost theatrical. We stepped closer to the heavy wooden door set into the tower's base. It hung slightly ajar, the rusted hinges complaining softly as Holmes pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of oil and old machinery. The faint tick of the clock's mechanism echoed through the hollow chamber like a heartbeat. A narrow iron staircase spiraled upward into the darkness. Holmes produced a small lantern from his pocket and lit it with a quick flick of his match. The light revealed dust motes drifting in the air and footprints, several of them imprinted upon the grime-covered floor. 2 sets, Holmes murmured. One heavier, leading inward. The other, lighter and more recent, leading outward. Whoever came last left in a hurry. We ascended the narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath our weight. As we reached the first landing, I caught sight of something glinting faintly beside the railing. Holmes stooped and retrieved it, a small brass key, no longer than my little finger. A clock key, he said, but not from this tower's mechanism. This belongs to something smaller, portable. A pocket watch, perhaps, or a musical box. He pocketed the key and continued upward. The second landing opened into the clock chamber, where the great gears turned slowly behind a lattice of iron. The pendulum swung with rhythmic precision, the sound of its motion deep and resonant. On the floor beneath it lay a thin smear of something dark. Blood, Holmes whispered. Just a trace, but enough to confirm Pettigrew was here before he was found below. He was brought up here after death, or perhaps he died here and was carried down later. He leaned close to the iron mechanism, studying its intricate components. Someone cleaned this. The brass is too bright in certain places, the residue of polish still visible, a feeble attempt to disguise tampering. I dare say the clock did not strike exactly on the hour that night. It was set deliberately. He turned to me, the lantern's glow casting sharp lines across his features. Watson, I suspect that the clock's chime was not the sound of time passing, but the signal of murder itself. Before I could speak, a faint creak echoed from below. Holmes extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging us into darkness. We stood, motionless, listening. A slow, deliberate set of footsteps ascended the staircase. Someone was coming up the tower, unaware that we were already within. Holmes leaned close, his breath barely audible. Stay still, my dear fellow. Whoever climbs these steps now may be the very hand that wound the clock of death. The sound of the approaching footsteps grew sharper, echoing up the narrow stairwell until each creak of the iron steps seemed to strike directly at the heart. Holmes raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence, and in the near dark I could see the gleam of his eyes fixed upon the doorway below. Whoever it was paused at the base of the landing, their lantern casting a weak cone of light that reached only halfway up the stair. Then came a faint cough, nervous, hurried, and the metallic jingle of keys. Holmes leaned close enough for his whisper to brush my ear. Observe, Watson. Whoever this intruder may be, he possesses a key to the tower. That narrows the field considerably. Either the caretaker or someone who wishes to appear as one. The figure stepped fully into view at last. It was a man in a rough overcoat and cap, his face half hidden by the glow of his lantern. He climbed slowly, glancing about with anxious caution. When he reached the first landing, Holmes stepped forward from the shadows. "Good evening," he said pleasantly, his voice calm but firm. The man froze, his lantern trembling in his grasp. "Lord, bless me. You near gave me the fright of my life," he gasped. "Quite possibly the second such fright you've experienced beneath this clock," Holmes replied coolly. "Might we inquire what brings you here at this hour?" The man's eyes darted between us, calculating whether to flee. Then, resigning himself, he said, "Name's Horace Fielding, sir. I'm the caretaker here. Been looking after this tower for near 10 years. He shifted uneasily. "Couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd come check the mechanism. The yard's been sniffing about since that poor fellow was found, and I wanted to be sure they hadn't meddled with my works." Holmes regarded him with a half-smile that revealed nothing, a commendable sense of responsibility. "Tell me, Mr. Fielding, were you on duty the night of the murder?" "I was, sir, though I left early. The rain came on heavy, and the square was deserted. I locked up before 10. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze sharp as a scalpel. "Locked up? Yet Pettigrew's body was found inside the square. And this door," he gestured to the one below, "bears no sign of forced entry. How do you explain that?" The caretaker hesitated. I don't rightly know. Maybe he had a key. Could be one of the old workmen had it copied." Holmes's expression did not change, but I could sense the tension in the air. "Curious, especially since the clock key found above does not match any from the tower. It suggests a visitor with peculiar interests in mechanisms. Tell me, Fielding, did you notice anyone about the square that week?" The man scratched his head, avoiding Holmes's eyes. "Well, now that you mention it, there was a tall fellow in a black coat, came round 2 evenings before, said he was an architect from the city surveyor's office. Took sketches of the tower, even measured the foundation. I thought nothing of it at the time." Holmes's eyes glimmered with sudden focus. "An architect, you say? Did he leave a name? Something foreign sounding. Hartman or Harden? Something like that." Holmes's hand tightened slightly upon his cane. "Hartman," he repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "Very good, Mr. Fielding. You've been most helpful." We left the tower shortly thereafter, the fog thicker than before, curling about the lampposts like ghostly fingers. Holmes strode briskly toward Baker Street, his silence so deep that I dared not interrupt it. Only when we reached the warmth of our sitting room did he finally speak. "Watson, you recall the name Hartman from the Foreign Office circular I showed you last spring?" I frowned. "The German engineer suspected of espionage in the South Dock plans." "Precisely. He vanished from London after the scandal, yet now reappears at the base of a clock tower mere days before a man is found murdered beneath it. Pettigrew worked in a banking firm that handled several of the government's industrial accounts. What if he uncovered something he ought not to have seen?" He began to pace, his eyes alight with cold fire. "A clock tower, a missing watch key. A chime struck at the wrong hour, all instruments of time, Watson. The pattern is deliberate. Pettigrew's death was not random violence. It was orchestration." I stared at him. "Then you believe the murder was political?" Holmes paused at the window, the city's fog glowing faintly beyond. "Perhaps. But politics is merely the stage. The motive, I suspect, is far more personal. We must find Hartman, and soon. For when a man begins to measure time in death, the next strike of the clock seldom waits long." Holmes spent the following morning in a state of silent concentration, moving between his desk and the window as though tracing invisible connections in the air. I occupied myself with the papers. Reviewing the brief report, the Times had published nothing beyond what we already knew. Pettigrew, clerk of the London and South Banking House, found dead beneath the clock tower, No theft, no apparent motive, no suspect. But Holmes's mind was not one to linger on what was known. He thrived on the gaps, the inconsistencies that ordinary men overlooked. At last, he spoke without turning. Watson, the caretaker's story, though seemingly honest, contains an unintentional admission. He said the yard had been sniffing about and that he feared they might have meddled with his works. Yet the police had not entered the tower until the following day. He knows more than he dares reveal. I frowned. Then you suspect Fielding of involvement? Not directly. The man's manner suggests fear, not guilt. Someone has warned him or paid him to keep silent. And there is the matter of this Hartman, who vanishes into the fog like a phantom architect. A man of science, an engineer of precision, returning to a clock tower for sketches, Watson. I dare say our murder is built upon the machinery of time itself. He reached for his violin and played a few slow notes, each one echoing through the flat like a thought-made sound. Our first course of action is clear. Pettigrew's employer may hold the key to Hartman's connection. A banking clerk does not die mysteriously without some trace left in the ledgers. Within the hour, we were seated in the offices of the London and South Banking House on Cheapside, where a pale young secretary ushered us into the manager's room. Mr. Andrew Calthorpe, a portly man with watery eyes and a nervous hand, greeted Holmes with excessive politeness. "A dreadful tragedy, Mr. Holmes," he said, mopping his brow. "Pettigrew was a most conscientious fellow, quiet, punctual, without vice of any kind. His death has unsettled us all." Holmes's tone was deceptively mild. "And yet, Mr. Calthorpe, you have not inquired as to the nature of his work in the days preceding his death. That suggests you already suspect what he was involved in." The manager blanched. I beg your pardon, sir." Holmes leaned forward. "Come now. Pettigrew handled government accounts, did he not? Industrial contracts relating to the South Dock expansion?" Calthorpe's hands twisted in agitation. "Yes, but those records are confidential. Surely you don't imply." "I imply only that someone sought access to those records. Perhaps Pettigrew discovered an irregularity, a false transaction, a payment that should not exist. Did he speak of a visitor?" After a long pause, Calthorpe nodded reluctantly. "There was one man, yes, about a week ago. A foreign gentleman called himself Mr. Hartman. Said he represented a firm involved in the clock mechanism for the new dock warehouses. Pettigrew met him privately after hours, against my advice." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Ah, and after that meeting?" Pettigrew seemed troubled, distracted even. "He came late one morning, and I noticed he had sealed an envelope with his own initials, a habit of his when dealing with confidential matters. He placed it in the private deposit box, number 32, which only he could open. The police have not yet requested it." Holmes rose. "Then I must." Calthorpe hesitated, but yielded under the force of Holmes's gaze. A few moments later, he returned with a small, sealed envelope. Holmes examined it closely before opening it with the delicacy of a surgeon. Inside lay a single sheet of foolscap paper, bearing only 3 lines, scrawled hastily in pencil. "The design is wrong. The chime will strike early. If I do not return, tell her the truth lies within the gears." Watson, there was no signature, but the handwriting was Pettigrew's. Holmes turned the page over, revealing faint smudges of oil and a partial print of a thumb in soot. He folded it carefully. A clock tower murder, a mistimed chime, and a victim who foresaw his death. The question is, who is her? A wife? A confidant? Or perhaps someone at the heart of the deception? Holmes pocketed the letter and smiled faintly. "The trail tightens, my dear Watson. Pettigrew's note tells us 2 things: that he knew he was in danger, and that the clock itself holds evidence yet unseen. Tonight, we return to Bartholomew's, but this time, not to observe. We shall listen to the clock strike, and perhaps it will speak." Night had settled thickly over London by the time we approached Bartholomew's Square again. The fog had deepened into a ghostly veil, swirling in slow eddies that blurred the outlines of buildings and muffled the sound of our footsteps. Holmes walked a few paces ahead, his tall figure cutting a narrow silhouette against the lamplight, his mind clearly consumed by silent calculation. I followed with some unease, the memory of the lifeless body beneath the clock tower still vivid in my thoughts. When we reached the tower, Holmes paused at its base and listened. The steady ticking within echoed faintly through the stone, like the heartbeat of some sleeping beast. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The clock stands as it did before, yet its rhythm is subtly wrong. Do you hear it?" I strained my ears, but heard only the uniform cadence of the mechanism. "It seems perfectly regular to me." "Ah, but it is precisely too regular," Holmes replied. "Timepieces of this size develop minute variations. A perfect rhythm implies interference. Someone has adjusted it since our last visit." He produced a thin strip of wire from his pocket and inserted it between the hinges of the door, pushing it open with care. Inside, the chamber was darker than before, the faint scent of machine oil mixing with the damp chill of the stones. Holmes lit his lantern, and its glow revealed the iron staircase rising upward in a tight spiral. We climbed cautiously. At the first landing, Holmes stopped and examined the floor. As I suspected, fresh footprints smaller than Fielding's, finer boots, a man of better means or more deliberate intention. The second landing brought us once again to the chamber of the clock. The pendulum swung steadily, its polished brass glinting in the lamplight. Holmes moved directly to the gears, his long fingers tracing the edges of the mechanism. After a moment, he drew out a small brass pin, smeared faintly with grease. "Proof," he said softly. "A delay pin. It interferes with the striking mechanism, forcing the chime to sound before or after the true hour." Pettigrew's note, "The chime will strike early," was no metaphor. It was literal. The murderer manipulated the clock to conceal the time of death. I stared in disbelief. Then Pettigrew must have discovered this alteration? Indeed. He likely confronted Hartman, or whoever employed him within this very chamber. A struggle followed, and Pettigrew was killed. But to preserve the illusion that the crime occurred at midnight, our culprit altered the clock's chime, ensuring his alibi remained unbroken. Holmes pocketed the pin and continued his search. He knelt beside the base of the pendulum, brushing aside dust until his fingers struck metal. When he withdrew his hand, it held a tiny mechanical device, no larger than a snuff box, its sides engraved with ornate patterns. "Watson," he said quietly, "our friend Hartman's true profession was not architecture, but design. This is no part of the tower's mechanism, it is a detonator. Crude, but clever. Likely intended to destroy evidence within the gears should the clock be opened." I recoiled. Good heavens, then we were minutes from triggering it ourselves. Holmes smiled faintly. "A fortunate habit of patience saved us. I rarely touch what I do not first understand." He examined the device, then tucked it carefully into a small pouch. "There is intelligence behind this, a network perhaps." Pettigrew stumbled upon something meant for secrecy, something involving the docks, the contracts, and Hartman's engineering skill. But even conspiracies are built by men, and men make mistakes. A sudden sound from below interrupted him, the echo of a door closing softly. Holmes's hand flashed to his coat pocket, where he withdrew his revolver. The faint scrape of shoes on stone told us the intruder was ascending. He gestured for me to extinguish the lantern. In the dark, we waited. The steps drew nearer, measured, deliberate, not hurried as before. Then a voice, low and accented, drifted up the stairwell. "Mr. Holmes, I feared you might come." Holmes's reply was calm, almost conversational. "And you feared correctly, Mr. Hartman." A pause, then a soft chuckle. "You are clever, but not clever enough. Leave now, and perhaps you will live to see another dawn." Holmes moved to the edge of the landing, his revolver steady. "You mistake me, sir. It is you who will see another dawn if you choose your next step with wisdom." Come up, and let us discuss your clockwork." There was silence. Then the faint metallic click of a weapon being drawn. Holmes's eyes glinted in the dark. "Ah," he murmured. "So we keep time by gunfire now. Very well, Watson. Brace yourself. The chime of midnight may yet ring true tonight." For one tense moment, all sound seemed to vanish from the chamber. The only noise was the slow, pendulous sweep of the clock's mechanism, tick-tock, tick-tock, marking each second with unbearable precision. Then, without warning, a shot cracked through the darkness. The bullet struck the iron gear behind Holmes, ricocheting in a burst of sparks. Holmes did not flinch. His revolver answered in the same instant, the flash of his muzzle lighting the chamber in a harsh white glare. A strangled cry echoed up the stairwell, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps retreating downward. Holmes was already in motion, leaping for the staircase with astonishing speed. "Watson, after him!" he called, and I followed, my heart hammering in my chest. The spiral stair twisted sharply, the shadows deepening with every step. Below, the intruder's lantern bobbed wildly, his breath ragged and his boots scraping against the stone. Then came a sharp, metallic clang. The door at the tower's base slammed shut. When we reached it, Holmes tried the handle, but it held fast. "He's barred it from the outside," he muttered. Without hesitation, he thrust his shoulder against the wood until it splintered and gave way. We burst into the open square, gasping in the cold night air. The fog had thickened into a silver curtain, swallowing the streets beyond. Somewhere ahead, we heard the faint clatter of hurried footsteps on cobblestones. Holmes darted to the right, following the sound through the mist. The glow of the fleeing man's lantern appeared briefly, like a will-o'-the wisp, before vanishing around a corner. When we rounded it ourselves, the light was gone. Only silence greeted us, save for the distant toll of another church bell striking the hour. Holmes stopped, breathing hard but still composed. "He knows these alleys," he said. "He planned this route. To vanish into fog is an old London trick, but an effective one." He crouched suddenly, examining the wet ground beneath a lamppost. "Ah, here look, Watson, a trail of oil. He must have carried the detonator or a similar device. It leaks slightly when disturbed." We followed the thin, gleaming line until it ended before a narrow archway leading to a stable yard. Inside, the lantern light flickered again briefly and then went out. Holmes raised his hand for silence. We crept closer, only to find the stable door swinging gently in the breeze. Within, a horse shifted uneasily, its reins half-fastened as though the rider had left in haste. A second glance revealed something glinting in the straw. A silver watch chain, broken clean through. Holmes picked it up, his brow furrowing. "The chain is of foreign make, German, by its links. Our friend Hartmann is certainly the man we seek. But his escape was not perfect. Haste breeds error." He turned the chain over and smiled faintly. "See this? A crest engraved beneath the clasp, not German-Austrian. That tells us he is not merely a mechanic or thief. He has connections, perhaps even sponsorship." As we left the yard, Holmes walked in silence, his mind clearly racing. "Watson," he said at last, "do you recall Pettigrew's message, 'Tell her the truth lies within the gears'? That phrase may hold more weight than we assumed. I suspect 'her' refers not to a person, but to an entity, perhaps the firm, or even the city itself. The gears are not only those of the Clocktower, but of a machine far greater, an operation of deceit and profit." I struggled to keep pace. "You believe Pettigrew uncovered a conspiracy connected to the South Dock contracts?" "Undoubtedly. Hartmann's designs for timing mechanisms could be repurposed for more sinister use, automatic detonators perhaps. If Pettigrew discovered a falsified payment or shipment, he may have threatened exposure. The murder silenced him and disguised the act as coincidence, and the altered clock served as the alibi." We reached Baker Street as the first light of dawn began to bleed through the fog. Holmes set his revolver aside and poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements precise, his expression unreadable. "He will not stay hidden for long," he said. "Men like Hartman cannot bear to leave their work unfinished. The detonator, the chain, the modified clock, these are threads of the same fabric. He will return to tie them off." He sat in his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "There is one final detail that troubles me." Pettigrew's note, its final line, was not signed, yet written in haste. That suggests he expected someone specific to find it, someone with access to the bank's private boxes. That person has not yet appeared. I looked up. "You mean the woman?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes. Whoever her truly is, she remains the missing piece of this clockwork, and until we find her, the hands of this mystery will not strike the hour of truth." Holmes's prediction proved eerily prescient. The next morning brought a visitor, a woman cloaked in black, her face pale and drawn beneath a thick veil. She arrived at Baker Street shortly after 9, her gloved hands trembling as she handed Mrs. Hudson a card inscribed with the name Miss Evelyn Pettigrew. When she entered our sitting room, she seemed the very image of grief held together by sheer willpower. Holmes rose at once and bowed slightly, gesturing for her to sit. "You are the sister of the late Reginald Pettigrew," he said gently. "I feared as much when I saw your name." "Yes, Mr. Holmes," she replied, her voice soft but resolute. "My brother's death has been unbearable. But I received a letter this morning that made me believe his death was no accident." She opened her reticule and produced a small folded note. Holmes took it, his brow furrowing as he examined the handwriting. "Written in haste," he murmured. "Same pencil mark, same curvature of the loops. It is indeed your brother's hand. And this was sent after his death?" "It was posted the day before," she said faintly. "But it only reached me today. I was away visiting friends near Richmond. He wrote that if anything were to happen to him, I must bring this to you." Inside the letter was a cryptic message. "Trust no one at the bank. The design hides more than profit. The clock chime is not just a sound, it is the key." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "The clock again, Watson. He speaks of design and chime." Pettigrew uncovered something mechanical, something meant to conceal or trigger an event. A timing mechanism, perhaps, linked to more than mere murder. Miss Pettigrew clasped her hands tightly. "My brother mentioned a foreign gentleman visiting him. He said the man spoke of improving the dock machinery. But when I asked more, Reginald told me it was better I did not know. He was frightened, Mr. Holmes. I had never seen him so afraid." Holmes nodded, pacing thoughtfully before the past. "Fire. Miss Pettigrew, you have done wisely in coming here. The man your brother met, Hartman, is no simple engineer. He is, I believe, an agent in the employ of foreign interests, possibly using the dock contracts as a cover for the transport of experimental machinery. Pettigrew must have discovered this and refused to cooperate." She looked stricken. "Then my brother was murdered to keep him silent?" "I fear so. But his message tells us something crucial, that the clock's chime was not a symbol but a signal. There is purpose in its sound. Perhaps even a code." Holmes's eyes drifted toward the window, where the faint toll of a distant bell sounded over the fog. "Watson, this afternoon we return to the tower once more. I wish to test a theory." When we reached Bartholomew's, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the square in its grey daylight melancholy. Holmes carried with him a small tuning device and a stethoscope-like instrument of his own invention. He ascended the staircase with deliberate steps, Miss Pettigrew waiting below under my care. Inside the clock chamber, he set his apparatus near the gears and began adjusting the mechanism minutely. Each movement produced a faint, metallic note. "Listen, Watson," he said at last. "Each strike of the chime is not uniform. There is a subtle variance in pitch between every fourth and fifth note, too deliberate to be natural wear." He struck the chime again, then smiled thinly. "There is a hollow resonance beneath the fifth tone. A compartment, I suspect. Using a small chisel from his pocket, he pried at the inner edge of the brass casing until a concealed panel shifted open. Within it lay a small metal cylinder, sealed with wax and stamped with an unfamiliar insignia, an eagle clutching a gear. Holmes turned it in his hand, his expression grim. This, Watson, is the heart of our mystery, a micro-mechanism for delayed ignition, ingenious, efficient, and catastrophic if connected to an explosive source. Pettigrew must have discovered that the tower was being used as a prototype for a timing device. As we descended to the square, Miss Pettigrew rose anxiously to meet us. Holmes handed her the cylinder carefully. "Your brother's courage saved many lives. But the men who built this will not rest easily. They will come for it, and when they do, we shall be waiting." The great clock struck the hour then, its chime echoing through the air like the heartbeat of London itself. Holmes glanced upward, his expression thoughtful. "The gears have spoken, Watson. Now let us see who comes to silence them." Holmes insisted we return Miss Pettigrew safely to her lodgings before taking further steps. Throughout the cab ride, she clutched the small metal cylinder in her gloved hands, as though afraid it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Holmes sat opposite her, silent, his eyes half closed yet alert, as if every clatter of the wheels fed some quiet calculation within his mind. When at last we reached her modest residence near Russell Square, he spoke for the first time. "Miss Pettigrew, you must not, under any circumstance, show that device to anyone else. Keep your curtains drawn and answer no strangers. Should anyone inquire after your brother or mention the Clocktower, send word to Baker Street immediately." Her voice trembled. "Do you think they will come for me?" Holmes's expression softened only slightly. "They will not harm you, I promise. Their interest lies solely in recovering what your brother found. That makes you both their last obstacle and their last witness." She nodded silently, and as we departed, I caught her whisper a faint prayer before closing the door. Holmes said nothing until we were halfway down the street. "She will be watched before morning," he murmured. "Our adversary will not risk leaving that device in civilian hands. Therefore, Watson, we must turn the hunter's game upon himself." "And how do you propose we do that?" I asked. "By letting him think he has succeeded." Back at Baker Street, Holmes set the cylinder upon the table under the lamplight. He examined it closely through his lens, every movement deliberate, his brow drawn into furrows of intense thought. "The mechanism is sealed, yet its weight betrays something within. Listen." He shook it gently. There was the faintest rattle, metallic and rhythmic, like a spring compressed. A clockwork trigger. No powder residue. It is a prototype only intended to demonstrate timing precision without risk of explosion. So Pettigrew intercepted this before the weapon was completed. "Precisely," Holmes said. "But its symbolism was more dangerous than its substance. Whoever controls this design controls the contracts that shape London's future. Think of it. Watson mechanical timers on a mass scale, automating power systems, controlling cranes, shipping locks, even weapons. Pettigrew's discovery threatened not one man, but an entire network of profit and espionage." He leaned back, eyes glittering in the lamplight. "Our next step is simple. Hartman must be made to believe the cylinder has been returned to the Clocktower. That will draw him from his hiding place." By the following evening, everything was in motion. Holmes had enlisted Lestrade's reluctant cooperation, though not without resistance. "You want me to leave a known criminal trap in the open?" Lestrade barked when we met him near the square. "If the Yard hears of this, I'll be suspended." Holmes merely smiled. "You'll also have a murderer in chains by morning. Which outcome do you prefer?" Under cover of darkness, we replaced the cylinder in its concealed compartment within the clock. Holmes worked swiftly, ensuring every trace of our interference was erased. When finished, he extinguished the lantern and withdrew to a nearby rooftop overlooking the square. We settled there, shrouded by fog, the faint sound of the tower's mechanism marking the passing minutes. Hours crawled by. The damp cold crept into my bones, and I began to wonder if Holmes's plan would fail. But near midnight, movement stirred below. A tall figure emerged from the mist, moving with the deliberate caution of a man accustomed to secrecy. Even in the faint glow of a street lamp, I recognized him at once. "Hartman," Holmes whispered. The man approached the tower door, glanced about, then produced a key and slipped inside. Holmes motioned for silence, and we followed, descending quietly through the shadows. Inside, the faint light of a lantern illuminated Hartman's broad shoulders as he knelt before the clock's inner chamber, prying at the panel we had sealed. Holmes stepped forward. "Good evening, Mr. Hartman. The hour is late for maintenance work." The man froze, his hand hovering above the cylinder. Then he rose slowly, turning toward us. His face was calm, almost serene, though his eyes burned with cold fury. "I should have known," he said softly. "Only one man in London could unsettle my plans so efficiently." Holmes's revolver gleamed faintly in the light. "You flatter me, sir. I prefer to think of myself as merely punctual." Hartman's gaze flicked to me, then back to Holmes. "Do you know what you interfere with? This city runs on power, trade, and timing. What I have built would have changed the world. By destroying it first," Holmes asked sharply. "You murdered Pettigrew because he discovered your device's true purpose to synchronize detonations across multiple dock sites, crippling London's supply lines and paving the way for your sponsors abroad." A bitter smile crossed Hartman's face. "You understand more than I expected, but it will not matter. The gears are already set in motion. You cannot stop time, Mr. Holmes." With that, his hand darted to his coat. Holmes fired first. The shot struck the lantern, plunging us into darkness. A struggle ensued, brief, violent, and echoing in the confined chamber. I grappled blindly, my hand striking cold metal before a blow knocked me sideways. Then came the sound of shattering glass and a cry of pain. When the light returned, Lestrade having burst in with his men, Hartman lay slumped against the wall, his arm bleeding and the cylinder crushed beneath his boot. Holmes knelt beside it, examining the remains. "He tried to destroy it," he said quietly. "Perhaps even to silence himself." Lestrade secured the man and turned to Holmes. "Blast it, you were right. But what on earth was all this for?" Holmes rose, brushing dust from his coat. "For greed disguised as progress. Inspector, Pettigrew uncovered the shadow behind London's new industry, a web of foreign influence. Each thread wound around the tick of a clock. Had Hartman succeeded, this city would have been brought to its knees by its own ambition." As dawn broke over the square, the first rays of light touched the clock tower's face. Holmes stood looking up at it, his expression distant. "Strange, is it not, Watson?" he said softly. "How men seek to master time, yet it is time that always masters them." And as the tower struck the hour, its chime clear and untampered, now echoed across the waking city like a final note of judgment. The morning after Hartman's capture dawned grey and wind-swept. The newspapers were already filled with the tale, "Foreign Engineer Arrested in Clocktower Plot." Screamed the headlines, but Holmes had not stirred from his chair since the previous night. He sat motionless by the fire, his eyes fixed on the remnants of the crushed cylinder that lay upon the table. The smell of burnt oil still lingered faintly in the air. I had grown accustomed to his silences, but this one felt heavier, darker, as though his mind were circling some unseen corner of the case that refused to yield. At last, I ventured to break the stillness. "You've caught the man, Holmes. Surely that must satisfy even your exacting standards." He looked up, his expression distant. "We have caught a man, Watson. But I am not yet convinced we have caught the man. Hartman was the instrument, clever, yes, but not the hand that wounded him." Before I could reply, there came a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, looking weary but triumphant. "Holmes, you've done it again. The Foreign Office is in raptures. They say Hartman's confession will avert a diplomatic scandal." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Confession? Then he has spoken?" Lestrade nodded. "Aye, He admitted to building the mechanism and meeting Pettigrew, though he claims he never intended the device for destruction, says it was part of an industrial contract. Some rot about precision timing for hydraulic gates. Holmes's voice was quiet but sharp. Did he explain why he carried a loaded revolver when visiting his supposed contract site, or why his employers are listed under names that do not exist? Lestrade grimaced. He dodged those, said he was being followed, feared for his life. Still, the Yard's content. Once the Foreign Office signs off, he'll be handed over for extradition. Then the truth, Holmes said softly, will be neatly buried under layers of diplomacy. He rose, pacing the room. Watson, recall Pettigrew's words, trust no one at the bank. I fear that warning extends farther than we imagined. The question remains, who financed Hartman's invention? And why was it hidden in a public clock tower of all places? Lestrade frowned. Surely that's just where Pettigrew stumbled on him. Holmes gave a thin smile. Nothing in London happens by chance, Inspector. The tower is government property, maintained by private contractors paid through the same accounts Pettigrew oversaw. Follow the money, and we find the same mind. Lestrade sighed. If it were anyone but you saying that. Holmes turned to me suddenly. Watson, fetch your coat. We're paying another visit to the London and South banking house. Calthorpe, the manager, looked far less confident than during our first interview. The headlines had clearly reached him. Perspiration glistened on his brow. Mr. Holmes, I assure you, all accounts have been reviewed. We cooperated fully with the police. I do not doubt your compliance, Holmes replied coolly. But your late employee warned his sister not to trust this institution. That implies the corruption lies within, not without. Calthorpe's lips trembled. That's absurd. Pettigrew was, Holmes cut him off, about to expose a forged ledger entry, one transferring funds to a phantom company known as Continental Engineering Limited. The same company that employed your Mr. Hartman. Calthorpe slumped in his chair. Good God, you can't mean, Holmes's tone hardened. I mean that someone in this very building facilitated payment for the construction of a device meant to destabilize London's industry. Pettigrew uncovered it, and for that, he was killed. The manager hesitated, then whispered, if that's true, it could only have been Mr. Jonathan Vane, the assistant auditor. He oversaw all foreign disbursements. But he left for the continent a fortnight ago. Holmes's eyes flashed. A fortnight? That coincides precisely with Hartman's return to the tower. The puppeteer vanished just as his instrument took the stage. When we left the bank, Holmes's stride was quick and purposeful. Vane, he said under his breath. A man of numbers, logic, and quiet power. The sort who hides treason under balance sheets. But surely he's gone by now, I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Not entirely. A man does not flee without leaving a trace. And I have a suspicion he left one with Miss Pettigrew. That evening, we returned to her lodgings. She greeted us anxiously, though relief softened her expression when she saw Holmes alive. Mr. Holmes, have you caught the man responsible? Not yet, Miss Pettigrew, he said gently. But tell me, did your brother ever mention a Jonathan Vane? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, he said. Mr. Vane had advised him to keep quiet about certain irregularities in the foreign accounts. But Reginald told me he no longer trusted him. He said Vane had been pressing him to sign off the ledgers early, before the audit. Holmes's expression grew grave. That settles it. Pettigrew refused, and Vane needed him silenced. Hartman was merely the tool. Just then, a soft tapping sounded at the window. Holmes crossed the room swiftly, pulling the curtain aside. A scrap of paper was wedged between the panes, a note, written in hurried scrawl. They know she has it. Midnight. Beware the clock tower, Miss Pettigrew gasped. Holmes read the message twice, his jaw tightening. So the game begins again. Hartman's allies mean to finish what he could not. He turned to me, his voice low but urgent. Watson, time is no longer on our side. Midnight approaches, and I fear that the Clocktower may once again be set to strike death instead of the hour. The hours that followed were among the most tense I have ever known in our long association. Holmes moved with restless precision through the rooms of Baker Street, assembling what appeared to be an array of ordinary tools: a magnifying glass, a lantern fitted with blue glass, a small coil of insulated wire, and his revolver, freshly oiled. Outside, the wind rose over the city like a distant murmur of the sea. The note's warning, "Midnight, beware the Clocktower," echoed in my mind with every tick of the mantel clock. At 11:30, Holmes stood ready. "Watson," he said quietly, fastening his cloak, "what we are about to face is not merely vengeance, but preservation. Vane intends to destroy the evidence before dawn, and if I am right, he will use the tower itself to do it." "Destroy it how?" I asked. "By fire, explosion, or collapse, it hardly matters which. The tower is symbolic, Watson. Pettigrew's death beneath it was the prelude. Its destruction would erase all trace of the conspiracy and leave London with a tragedy, not a scandal. Come, we must be there before the chime of 12. We left the cab at the edge of Bartholomew's Square, where the fog swirled low and heavy. The gas lamps flickered fitfully, throwing uncertain halos across the wet stones. The great clock loomed above, its hands pointing to 5 minutes before midnight. For a long moment we stood listening, no sound save the faint hum of the gears turning within and the whisper of the wind through the ironwork. Holmes raised a finger. "He's inside." "How can you tell?" "The pendulum's rhythm has changed. He's tampering with it." Without another word, he drew his revolver and pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, the air was thick with oil and dust. A dim glow flickered from above, and I caught the faint scrape of metal upon metal. We climbed swiftly, each step a whisper on the iron stairs. As we neared the chamber, Holmes extinguished his lantern and motioned for silence. At the top, a man stood hunched over the clock's great mechanism, a lantern at his feet and a bundle of wires in his hands. His coat was torn, his hair disheveled, but his movements were methodical, precise. When he turned, the light revealed the sharp, pale features of Jonathan Vane. Holmes stepped forward, voice cold as steel. "You are punctual, Mr. Vane. How fitting." Vane froze. For a heartbeat he looked almost relieved, then smiled faintly. "I wondered if you'd come, Mr. Holmes. You're too clever to leave the hour unguarded." "Cleverness is irrelevant," Holmes said. "Your scheme was doomed the moment Pettigrew wrote his warning." Vane laughed quietly. Pettigrew was sentimental. He thought conscience could stop progress. "But progress, Mr. Holmes, demands sacrifice. Hartman's device would have revolutionized industry. I merely ensured its funding and my future. By murdering a man whose only crime was honesty. By securing what had to be secured," Vane replied calmly. "Hartman's arrest changed nothing. The contracts will pass through other names, other banks. But tonight, I finish what began beneath this tower. The chime will sound, and the last record of our transactions will burn with it." Holmes's gaze flicked to the wires at Vane's feet. "An electrical fuse." "Precisely," Vane said, almost with pride. "When the clock strikes 12, a spark will run through the coil and ignite the charge in the lower vault. Efficient. Elegant. I learned from Hartman's failures." Holmes stepped closer, his revolver unwavering. "And what of Miss Pettigrew? Would you make her collateral too?" For the first time, a shadow crossed Vane's expression. "She was never meant to be part of this. But she has something that belongs to me. The design's final cipher. Give it to me, and perhaps I'll let you live to see what progress looks like." "The cylinder is destroyed," Holmes said. "You'll find nothing left to salvage." Vane's composure faltered. "You're lying." Holmes smiled faintly. "Am I? Then look for yourself." In that instant, as Vane's eyes darted downward, Holmes moved. With a swift motion, he seized the wire coil and flung it across the room. The fuse snapped free just as the first toll of midnight thundered through the chamber. Vane lunged for the mechanism, but Holmes struck him hard across the arm, sending the lantern crashing to the floor. The flames sputtered, then caught the oil, and in seconds the lower stairs were ablaze. "Watson, the stairs!" Holmes shouted. We dragged Vane away from the spreading fire as smoke began to fill the chamber. The gears of the clock turned relentlessly, their grinding echo mingling with the deep, mournful chime that shook the very air. Vane struggled fiercely, shouting curses as Holmes bound his wrists with his own belt. "You'll never stop it! The charge is lit. The fire will reach it." Holmes's eyes gleamed through the haze. "Then we must move faster than time itself." Together we half-carried, half-dragged Vane down the winding stairs. The flames licked higher, chasing our heels. At the base, Holmes threw open a narrow service door I had never noticed before, leading into a cold, stone passage that sloped beneath the square. We stumbled through it, just as the tower roared behind us, a deep, muffled boom followed by the sound of falling stone. The air rushed outward in a wave of heat and soot. When at last we emerged onto the far side of the square, the tower still stood, its upper windows shattered but the structure intact. The clock face was dark, its hands frozen forever at 12. Lestrade and his men, alerted by Holmes earlier that evening, were already arriving. Holmes handed over the unconscious Vane. "You'll find his confession in the wreckage above, and with it, the ledgers from the bank he had hidden them behind the clock's panel." Lestrade looked at him in astonishment. "You mean you knew he'd set this up?" Holmes brushed the soot from his sleeve. "I suspected as much. Men who deal in false time cannot resist the drama of a final hour." As dawn crept over the city, the smoke from the clock tower rose into the pale sky like the ghost of a departed soul. Holmes stood watching it for a long while, silent, his face unreadable. "You look troubled," I said softly. He turned toward me, his eyes reflecting the flicker of the dying embers. "Troubled, perhaps, that men such as Vane will always exist. Of greed, Watson, is eternal. It ticks as surely as any clock. But so long as truth has a pulse, there will always be someone to wind it back." And as the sun broke through the fog at last, casting a faint golden light upon the battered tower, I knew that the hour of truth had indeed struck, brought forth by the one man in London who could never be late.